Welcome to Static Screams. These are real encounters, real people, real fear. The kind of stories that stay with you long after the lights come back on. Make yourself comfortable. Turn down the lights. And whatever you do, don't listen alone.
He knew my name. I was 23 when it happened, living alone for the first time in my life in a small apartment on the third floor of a building I genuinely believed was safe. It was in a decent part of the city. Good locks. A front door that required a key fob. I had done everything right. I felt secure. It was a Tuesday night in late November, maybe 11:30. I remember because I had an early shift the next morning and I was frustrated that sleep wouldn't come. I'd been lying in bed staring at the ceiling for over an hour when I finally gave up and got up to get a glass of water. The kitchen faces the street. I didn't bother turning on the light because the glow from outside was enough to see by. I just stood there in the dark, drinking slowly, looking down at the empty road below. It was that particular kind of city quiet you only get after midnight, where you can hear your own breathing. That's when I saw him. A man standing on the sidewalk directly across from my building. Just standing there. Not walking anywhere. Not on his phone. Not waiting for a cab or checking his watch. Just standing completely still, looking up at the building. I watched him for a moment, told myself he was waiting for someone. Maybe a late-night visitor who hadn't buzzed him in yet. People wait outside buildings all the time. I finished my water and went back to bed. At 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that pulled me out of sleep so fast I was sitting upright before I was fully conscious. A knock. Not at my front door. At my window. 3rd floor. I sat completely still and didn't move for what felt like a full minute. My brain was cycling through every rational explanation it could find and coming up empty. Then it came again. 3 slow knocks. Measured. Deliberate. Patient. Like whoever was doing it had all the time in the world. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and called my neighbor Sarah, who lived 2 doors down on the same floor. She picked up after 1 ring, which already told me something was wrong because it was 2 in the morning, and she answered like she'd been waiting. Before I could say a single word, she whispered to me, "There's someone outside my window, too." We stayed on the phone together until the sky started getting light. We didn't call the police because neither of us could bring ourselves to look out the window to confirm what we'd heard. We just talked in low voices and waited for morning. When the sun finally came up, I looked out. The street below was empty. Normal. A garbage truck was making its rounds. Someone was walking a dog. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Later that morning, the building manager was doing routine checks and found something on the exterior fire escape that ran along the back of the building. Footprints. Fresh ones. Leading up from the ground level all the way to the roof. The fire escape passed directly in front of several windows on each floor, including mine, including Sarah's. But what none of us could explain, what the building manager pointed out to me specifically when he came to check my window, was what was written in the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on the outside of my windowsill. My name. Just my first name. Written carefully, in neat letters, like someone had taken their time with it. The building manager went pale when he saw it. He asked me if I had any idea who could have done it, if I had any enemies, if anyone had been bothering me. I said no to all of it, because at the time it was true. I didn't know anyone who would do something like that. I still don't. I moved out that weekend, broke my lease, lost my deposit, and didn't care even slightly. I never found out who was on that fire escape. I never found out how they knew my name. And on nights when I can't sleep, which still happens more than I'd like to admit, I find myself thinking about how long they must have been watching me before that night. Long enough to learn my name. Long enough to know which window was mine. The man at the rest stop. I've been driving long-haul routes for 11 years. When you spend that much time alone on the road at night, you develop something that I can only describe as a second sense. A gut instinct for situations that don't feel right. You see enough of the world from behind a windshield in the dark, and you start to read people and places the way other people read words on a page. You learn very quickly to trust that feeling when it comes. Last October, I was running a route through the Midwest. Nothing unusual, a drive I'd done probably 30 times before. I pulled into a rest stop off the interstate at around 2 in the morning. Standard stop. Half a dozen other trucks in the lot, a couple of passenger cars, the usual arrangement of vending machines under buzzing fluorescent lights that make everything look slightly wrong at that hour. I got out to use the bathroom and grab a coffee from the machine. On my way back to the truck, I noticed a man leaning against the hood of a silver sedan parked 2 spots down from where I'd pulled in. He was just leaning there with his arms crossed, watching me walk across the parking lot. No expression on his face. Not aggressive, not nervous, not tired the way everyone looks at a rest stop at 2 in the morning. Just watching. I nodded at him the way you do. Basic human acknowledgement. He didn't respond. Didn't nod back. Didn't look away. Just kept watching me with that same flat expression. I got in my truck and locked the doors. Told myself it was nothing. People are strange at 2 in the morning. I started eating the sandwich I'd packed and checked my route notes. After about 10 minutes, I looked up into my side mirror almost without thinking about it. He was still there, same position against the hood of the sedan, still watching my truck. I want to be clear about something. In 11 years of night driving, I have seen a lot of strange things at rest stops. This was different. There was something about the stillness of him. Most people, even when they're just standing around, shift their weight, check their phone, look around. This man had not moved in 10 minutes. He was just watching my truck, with the same focused attention he'd had when I first noticed him. I started my engine. He didn't move. I pulled out of my spot slowly and crossed the parking lot toward the exit. I watched him in my mirrors the entire time. He tracked my truck with his eyes all the way across the lot without moving his body at all. Just his eyes. Following me. I merged back onto the interstate and drove. I put about 40 miles between me and that rest stop before I felt my shoulders come down from around my ears. I told myself I was being paranoid. I almost believed it. 3 days later, a trucker I know, a guy named Dale who runs similar routes, called me out of nowhere. First thing he asked was whether I'd stopped at that rest stop on the night I'd been through. I said yes. He went quiet for a moment that went on long enough that I asked if he was still there. He said yes. Then he told me that the morning after I'd been at that rest stop, a woman had been found unconscious in her car in that same parking lot. She'd been there all night. She was alive, but only just. He told me the car she was found in was a silver sedan. I've thought about that night hundreds of times since then, about whether the man I saw was waiting for her, about whether he'd been watching other trucks before mine, about what would have happened if I'd gotten out of my truck to ask him if everything was okay, about how long he stood there after I left, and who else pulled in after me. Night shift. I worked nights at a 24-hour pharmacy for almost 2 years. It pays better than days, which is the only reason most people take it. And after the first few weeks, you adjust to the hours, and it becomes its own kind of normal. Most nights follow the same pattern. You restock, you count inventory, you help the occasional person who comes in looking exhausted and sick, and you watch the clock move. It's quiet work, routine work, the kind of job where you stop expecting anything unusual to happen because it almost never does. Except for one night in February of my second year. It was around 3 in the morning. The pharmacy had been empty for over an hour. My coworker Marcus had gone to the back to check in a delivery that had arrived late, leaving me alone at the front counter. I was reorganizing a display of cold medicine when the automatic doors slid open. A man walked in, late 40s, I'd guess. Neat clothes, Dark jacket, dark pants, average height, average build. Nothing about his appearance was unusual or alarming. He walked directly to the counter without stopping to look at anything in the store, which people sometimes do but always gives me a slight pause because it means they came in knowing exactly where they were going. He stood at the counter and looked at me. Didn't say anything immediately. Just looked. I asked him how I could help. He smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile that uses the right muscles but doesn't reach the eyes. And he said, "You close at 4, right?" I told him, yes, we close at 4. It was a normal enough question. People ask about hours all the time. He nodded slowly, still with that smile, and then he said, "Good. That gives me plenty of time." He held eye contact for just a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he turned around and walked back out through the automatic doors without buying anything, without picking anything up, without giving any indication of what he'd actually come in for. I stood at the counter and watched him through the glass front of the pharmacy. He walked to the edge of the parking lot, just past the reach of the overhead lights, and he stopped. And he stood there, facing the building. I called Marcus immediately. He came up front, looked out, and we both stood there watching this man stand in the dark at the edge of the parking lot. Marcus called the non-emergency police line while I kept watching. The man didn't move. He just stood there in the dark, facing us, for the entire 20 minutes it took for a patrol car to arrive. By the time the officer pulled into the lot, the man was gone. The officer walked the full perimeter of the building, checked the parking lot, checked the alley behind the building. Nothing. Then he came to the back of the pharmacy and asked us to come outside. Under the window of the staff break room, the room Marcus had been in alone for the first part of that night, the officer had found something sitting on the ground against the wall, a folding knife, sitting upright, blade fully open, pointing toward the building. The officer asked us if either of us had put it there. We hadn't. He asked if we'd heard anything near the back of the building during the night. We hadn't. We closed early that night. I drove home with every light in my car on and called someone to stay on the phone with me the entire way. I finished out my notice period on day shifts only. My manager didn't argue when I told her why. I think about Marcus being alone in that back room for those 20 minutes a lot. I think about what the man meant when he said that gave him plenty of time. I think about the fact that if the delivery hadn't come in that night, Marcus wouldn't have been in the back at all. And I wonder if the man already knew that. The hiking trail. I have hiked alone my entire adult life. I know that most people who hear that immediately tell me it's dangerous, and I've always smiled and nodded and then gone out alone anyway, because I knew those trails. I'd been walking them for years. I knew which ones flooded in spring, which ones had the best views, which ones were quiet enough that you could go an entire morning without seeing another person. I was not reckless about it. I was experienced. I trusted myself out there. That trust took a significant hit on a Saturday morning in early spring, about 3 years ago. I was 4 miles into a trail I'd completed at least 30 times before. The trees were still bare from winter, so visibility through the woods on either side of the trail was good, maybe 40 or 50 feet in most directions. The sky was overcast but dry. I had water, I had snacks, I had my phone. Everything was normal. Somewhere around the 4-mile mark I got the feeling. I don't know how else to describe it except to say that if you've ever had it, you know exactly what I mean. It's not a sound or a sight or anything you can point to. It's a sudden and complete certainty that something has changed in your environment, that something is present that wasn't present before, and that whatever it is aware of you. Every animal has this instinct. Most people have just spent so long in safe environments that they've forgotten how to trust it. I stopped walking and looked around. The trail in both directions was empty. The woods on either side were still and quiet. No movement, no sound beyond the wind. I stood there for a full minute, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was nothing and started walking again. About a quarter mile later, I heard footsteps behind me. Not distant, not far off in the woods, on the trail, maybe 20-25 feet back, matching my pace almost exactly. The almost is what made it wrong. A person just walking the trail would naturally fall into their own rhythm. These footsteps were deliberately matching mine, adjusting when I adjusted, maintaining that same fixed distance. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I walked faster, they walked faster. When I stopped, they stopped. I turned around. The trail was completely empty as far as I could see. I stood there looking back the way I'd come for a full minute. No one appeared. No one stepped out from the trees. The trail was empty and silent. I turned back around and started walking again, and within 30 seconds the footsteps were back. Same distance, same pace. I made a decision then. I did not run. Something in my gut told me very clearly that running was wrong, that running would change something about the situation that I did not want changed. So I walked. I walked as steadily and deliberately as I could, and I did not look back again. And I covered the 2 miles back to the trailhead in what felt like the longest stretch of time I have ever experienced. The footsteps stayed with me the entire way, sometimes a little closer, sometimes slightly further back, but always there, always present, always adjusting to match me. When I came out of the tree line into the trailhead parking lot, I walked directly to my car, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking enough that I missed the ignition twice. I sat there and looked back at the trailhead entrance. 30 seconds later, a man walked out of the trees. He was tall, wearing dark clothing, and he stopped at the edge of the parking lot and looked directly at my car. We looked at each other through my windshield for what I think was about 5 seconds. Then he turned around and walked back into the woods. I drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for 15 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I still hike, but I've never gone back to that trail, and I've never gone alone again. Wrong house. My sister and I grew up in a house at the end of a dead-end street in a small town where nothing ever happened. The kind of neighborhood where people left their cars unlocked and kids rode bikes until after dark, and everyone knew which house belonged to which family. We'd lived there since I was 3 years old. 14 years of complete, unremarkable safety. The night I'm about to tell you about happened when I was 17. My parents were out for dinner. My sister was sleeping over at a friend's house. I was home alone, something that had never bothered me before in my life, watching a movie in the living room with the volume low because I'd been on the phone earlier and forgotten to turn it back up. That's probably why I heard it. The front door handle turned. Not a knock, not the doorbell, the handle. Moving slowly, the way you'd turn it if you were trying to be quiet about it, or if you weren't sure the door would be locked and you wanted to find out before committing to anything. I muted the television immediately. My whole body went very still. The handle turned again, the same slow, careful rotation, and then stopped when it hit the lock. A pause of about 15 seconds. Then footsteps on the porch, moving to the right, around the side of the house. I got off the couch and crouched on the floor beside it. I know that sounds strange, but in the moment, it felt like the most important thing I could do was get lower, get smaller, get away from the sight lines of the windows. I called my dad. He answered on the second ring, and I whispered to him what was happening. He told me to stay down, stay quiet, stay away from the windows, and that he was leaving the restaurant right now and would be there in 12 minutes. The footsteps went along the right side of the house and stopped somewhere near the living room window. I could see the shadow of a person through the curtain, just standing there on the other side of the glass, not trying to open the window, not knocking, just standing there, present, waiting. I stayed on the phone with my dad. I didn't speak. He didn't speak. I just needed to hear his breathing on the other end of the line while I watched that shadow on the curtain and counted seconds. The shadow stood there for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I counted, because I needed something to do with my mind other than imagine what was on the other side of that curtain. Then it moved, back around the front of the house, down the porch steps. I heard footsteps on the driveway, then on the road, and then the distant sound of a car door closing somewhere further down the street. An engine starting. Driving away. My dad arrived 12 minutes later exactly, the way he'd promised. He checked every window, every door, the backyard, the side of the house. Everything was locked. Nothing had been tampered with. There was nothing outside the living room window. Nothing to show anyone had been there except for a slight disturbance in the flower bed below the window where something had pressed into the soil. 2 days later, our neighbor across the street, an older woman named Patricia, who missed nothing that happened on our road, came over to mention something she thought we should know. She said that someone had knocked on her door that same Friday night, late, and asked her if she knew which house the new family had moved into. She told them she didn't know what they were talking about, that all the families on the street had been there for years. The person had thanked her politely and left. We weren't a new family. We had lived in that house for 14 years. Every neighbor on that street knew us. Nobody new had moved in. There was no new family, which means whoever came to our door that night already knew which house they wanted. They just wanted to know if anyone else had noticed them looking. 5 encounters. 5 ordinary nights that became something else entirely. The truth is, most of the time nothing happens. Most late nights are just late nights. Most strangers are just strangers. But sometimes the door handle turns when no one should be there. Sometimes the footsteps behind you match yours just a little too precisely. If you have a story like these, something that happened that you've never been able to explain, something that still wakes you up at night, send it to Static Screams. We want to hear it. Subscribe. And tonight, check your locks.